pronouncing that properly. By late February, South Korea was shutting down Busan, which is, I think, their third largest city. Early March, Italy shut down Lombardy, and then quickly, soon after, extended that to the entire country. March 24th, India shut down the entire country, causing massive disruption. And I don't know if you haven't seen the videos and images of what's been happening in India, I strongly advise you check that out, because it's really it's probably going to be one of the major stories after this pandemic, looking back at what happened in India over the past week. It's just been madness. So far, the US hasn't shut down nationally, but there have been shutdowns here and there across the nation. And the result of all this is falling demand. Now, I just chose to show demand for coal in China as an example of a basic commodity that you can use as a proxy for the rest of the economy. So this isn't the entire economy, but it's an example of demand for a very important commodity. And as you can see, kind of these are normal conditions. The white and blue lines represent 2018 and 2019. So this is what we would usually expect demand for coal to look like in February going into March. But in fact, it actually looked like the red line, which is, far lower than what we would expect. And there has been recovery in March. So this, falling demand, at least for coal, has recovered, and parts of China's economy are coming back online or even ramping up to record levels now that they are sort of out of the weeds. But the economy isn't a static thing. It's kind of an evolving and flexible system. So different commodities have been experiencing similar falling demand over the past month or two. Now, what happens when demand falls is there's a backlog of supply, right? So suddenly no one wants to buy anything because we're all scared. We don't want to go to work. We want to hold on to our cash. So because there's no demand, companies and there's just a lot of product available that isn't moving. So production will inevitably slow on some level at that point. And when production slows as the economy recovers and that backlog of supply clears, then there's a gap after the backlog clears where there's scarcity and there's just nothing being made. And for some products, this means that there might not be any, there might suddenly be a lot of products and then nothing. So it's kind of a dynamic process, but this is the general gist. Food and healthcare products are examples of industries that are affected by this sort of dynamic. With food, for instance, when actually it's been fairly stable, thankfully, because food is often locally sourced. But there are things, specific products like anything in America that's being shipped from South America, any of your kind of greens and certain fruits that aren't in season right now, they might not be always predictably available because of these sorts of dynamics. Similarly with healthcare, we all know that there's a shortage of healthcare products around the world. And when all of these dynamics start to build, it creates a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. If governments don't intervene, basically it can get out of hand. And what happens is we're all holding on to our cash, so there's not enough. So banks and other lenders don't have cash to lend, so there's not enough cash to kind of invest in the economy. And because there's not enough cash to invest, there's an economic slowdown in general, but that economic slowdown will then make people again kind of pull back and hold on to their cash which makes the economy slow down even more, which makes people hold on to their cash even more, and the whole thing just builds and builds. And we've seen that happen in previous economic slowdowns and depressions and recessions. It's kind of a classic problem. Thankfully, Congress stepped in recently and passed a law to stave that off for now. So they've invested a huge amount of cash, and they've kind of thrown cash into the banking sector. They've thrown cash into small businesses, and hopefully they're going to actually follow through on their promise to give people unemployment compensation and a sort of proto UBI sort of cash to everyday consumers like you and me. So we'll see where that goes. Now the thing is, the question is, with all this disruption, will supply chains collapse? And my feeling is they probably won't collapse, but they'll definitely be disrupted. It's kind of inevitable. So parts of China are already recovering. The Chinese economy is ramping back up, and other countries, South Korea, we'll probably see them recovering soon too. And major parts of the supply chain network around the world are switching over to sort of aircraft and air freight away from ocean freight. So because shipping ships that carry containers have been turned away at ports due to this virus, a lot of freight that has to be moved is being moved by airplanes. Airplanes are empty for the most part, and so we're seeing kind of record usage of air freight at the moment. And you can see these are Chinese companies, and they are spiking to record highs. These are really dramatic shifts over to air freight in the last month or two. Actually, I guess this is from the period of February to March 20th. So really huge spike in the last month. And, that's a good thing, but it doesn't mean we're done with this disruption. Logistics disruptions will continue to affect the US as long as we are keeping, or as long as we're kind of rolling out shutdowns at state borders and in a sort of a haphazard manner. So trucking is really going to be affected. New Jersey is currently experiencing a problem with trucking. Seafood is an example of an industry that's just completely decimated right now. You can't really do anything with seafood if it's not moved quickly. Like it goes bad within it goes bad quickly. So you have to move it, and that's just not happening. So the seafood industry is, suffering. Public transportation suffering, and we're now starting to see strikes at Amazon and Instacart and other e-commerce stores over the fact that these companies aren't providing their workers with enough protection or support during the pandemic. So all of these kinds of issues are going to start to, kind of add together and compound on each other. And on top of that, Congress has yet to solve this problem where people don't have income to pay their mortgages. So there's a looming mortgage crisis that could cause it could cause a credit crunch to happen despite low interest rates and despite the recent federal stimulus. So that's kind of the picture of where things stand right now. An economist that I follow, had this nice quote. I'll just read it real quick. So the quote is this: the world faces the prospect of a profound shift, a return to natural, which is to say self-sufficient economy. The shift is the very opposite of globalization. While globalization entails a division of labor among disparate economies, a return to natural economy means that nations would move towards self-sufficiency. All right, so he's an economist. He's already sort of signaling what we're going to get into now, which is this sort of divide between the global economy and the natural economy. And we'll get into the natural economy in part 3, but first let's talk about the global economy. And how is the global economy now going to respond? And this is the fun part, robots and automation. Or it's fun or scary, depending on which side of this you're on. So, robots are good and bad in some ways. Engineers that might watch this, please forgive me. I'm definitely not an engineer and I'm not an expert at all. So you might disagree. But, these are just a few things off the top of my head that I could think of that robots do better than humans. I mean, they don't get sick. So, in a pandemic, robots don't shut down. They never get tired. They, communicate instantly. You kind of do need to pay them. They are expensive to maintain, but in terms of wage negotiations with unions and all of that sort of thing, you don't have to worry about that with robots. They don't have human rights. You can basically, tell them to do what you want and they'll do it. And as a result, this trend towards automation that hopefully everybody is aware of will probably, in my view, accelerate now. So because of this crisis, companies have a new reason to invest in these technologies. So you're going to start seeing accelerating growth in automation sectors and robot sectors. And I particularly want you to pay attention to this, to the green panel on the right here. One of the key drivers for this market will be the increasing focus towards smart factories. And smart factories really are going to be, I'm focusing on smart factories because factories are traditionally where the heart of our economy is. Workers work in factories. That's where most goods are made in the world. And a factory without a worker is a novel idea. So let's just talk a little bit about what that might look like, what that means. There are documentaries out there on YouTube, and Netflix, I think, has a good documentary. I haven't seen it, but it's about factories automating. And the way it sort of works is you have these highly digitized manufacturing processes that are, completely automated. And they have this specific ability to be aware of the environment they're functioning in and respond in an adaptive way. So what that means is you have what are called cyber-physical systems, which really just mean a sort of a virtual computerized version of a factory. So you could think of it like a simulation of a factory. And then the real-time tools in the factory, the robots that are doing the work, all of these robots have sensors on them that are feeding data back into the simulation. And because that process is pretty much instantaneous in real time, the robots basically can adapt in instantly. So they can also communicate perfectly. So every process is connected and every manufacturing process can be adjusted relative to the way different parts of the factory are performing. And they're all connected through this idea of the Internet of Things, right? And the Internet of Things is kind of a buzzword, but it really just means these devices that are connected to the internet or networked together in some way so that they can coordinate. So the key design features of these smart factories are that they're instantly their communication is instant across the entire factory. There's a virtual simulation of the factory that allows the control, the control system to anticipate the processes as they unfold within the factory. And then there's this decentralized control. So each part of the factory is kind of autonomous within itself, but then networked together so that they can communicate in real time. And there are advantages to this. You know, when managers look at the factory and want to make decisions about what to do, how to manage production, they can get the most well-rounded reports out of this virtual simulated data connected to real outputs. They can get data that workers in traditional factories can't really provide. It's just impossible for workers to provide the level of data that these robots can provide to managers. And that allows managers to really control the quality of products and identify weak spots, identify areas to improve, and drive down costs. And then really importantly, they can perform maintenance before there are problems in the factory, which allows them to basically reduce downtime and keep quality control going and keep everything humming along. So that's kind of where we're going. And what does that mean for the post-pandemic economy specifically? You know, are we done with workers? Like, are they gone? Are they out? Probably not, but they are going to be, you know, a certain amount of workers will be displaced, right? There's just going to be, for certain professions, they won't be needed as they're replaced by robots. As automation accelerates, as these trends accelerate, they will displace workers. But, you know, the real thing that we want to focus on is that these supply chains, because these factories are going to be automated, the supply chains will be more robust in a certain sense when it comes to pandemics. And because they're automated, you don't need a access to cheap labor. You know, the robots are the labor, right? So there's no reason for companies to outsource factories to China or to other countries like Brazil in order to find cheap labor, because they just don't need labor, right? Workers are not a problem anymore. So they can bring factories closer to the source of demand for their products. So for instance, Apple is starting to look at bringing production of iPhones to Mexico. There are several other companies that are moving to Mexico, and this shift is already starting. All of these articles came out in the last week, I want to say, maybe the last 2 weeks. And there's a lot out there. So if you search, you know, something like global manufacturing shifting away from China, you'll get dozens of articles listing companies that are making this move, or at least considering moves like this, in order to shorten the distance in the supply chain between production and consumption. Okay, so what does that really mean for workers? I mean, it really puts workers in a bind. There are big problems here. You know, it seems like Andrew Yang was kind of on the right path. Maybe he didn't quite have his policy. You know, I kind of personally disagree with his policies in certain ways, but there are kernels of truth there. And UBI certainly seems like it could be part of a progressive platform going forward. But other parts of the progressive platform, you know, really have some problems. In the Q&A section, I hope to hear from some of you about your thoughts on what unions will do if these sort of smart factories really ramp up. And as also, you know, protectionist policies, you know, to protect domestic workers from outsourced labor, that might not even be relevant anymore if workers are no longer needed in certain sectors. So, Yeah, these are problems to think about in the post-pandemic economy. They might take on different. The questions might be posed slightly differently, and the answers might be slightly, different than they would have been just a couple of months ago. But there are things we need to think about as these shorter supply chains go into effect. And these shorter supply chains, while they'll probably be a little bit more stable in situations that where global trade is affected, they'll still have downside risks. Catastrophic failures will still be a problem, especially when production depends on the sourcing of natural resources like oil or heavy metals, or rare earth metals, I guess is what you would call them. Things like that, anything to do with mining, those sorts of resources are still going to be, part of a global trade system, and they're not really going to be insulated from catastrophes like this pandemic. And there are still going to be problems. I guess another one is that as these global supply chains shorten, there will be more factories in different locations. So Apple might have a factory in Mexico, it might have another factory in Brazil, another factory in China, so that the production of the iPhone is closer to where the demand is, right? But because of this distributed system of factories, these companies will be dealing with uneven regulatory environments across different countries and continents, which they already are to a large extent. I mean, these are multinational corporations, but as the supply chains shorten, regulatory environments will become, the impact of the regulatory structures in different companies could have more of an effect on the way these companies function. Sorry, yeah. So that's kind of the picture, and it really shows that there are opportunities here for people to step in, and that's the big question. How can we rise to meet the demand that these global companies can't meet? As these global companies try to deal with the pandemic and the aftermath, as they try to shore up their systems, there's still going to be problems that they can't really address. We all know that global climate change is coming, pollution is coming, and these are kind of maybe over the top examples, but I just kind of threw them out there as ideas of problems that we could address at a community level. For instance, you can't ship iPhones from Mexico if a super storm is destroying roads, or if Trump doesn't order medical supplies, it really doesn't matter whether the companies are making them. So our political leaders can have a huge impact on global supply chains. And then, of course, inequality means that globally made goods may not be within range of someone's budget, or regular people's budget, especially if people are out of work because they're no longer working in factories, or if the government has a policy in place such that UBI doesn't allow them to purchase goods outside of a certain range, luxury goods, for instance, or even just, that nice shampoo. Maybe on your government UBI budget in the future, you'll only be able to afford the middle tier shampoo, not the top tier shampoo. Those sorts of problems, they'll start to, arise. And the key here is that scarcity is always unpredictable. So we really can't predict exactly which products are going to be affected by these disruptions of global trade. we can't say when certain products will be available or unavailable. Who could have predicted 2 months ago that suddenly medical masks would be scarce? No one, at least no one outside of that small circle of experts in universities and policymakers in the government who clearly, the current administration didn't listen to. Outside of that group of people, really no one could have predicted that these sorts of things would be necessary. And if we could have predicted, we probably would have started preparing, because one of the things that we're learning about this pandemic is that it is because it's unpredictable, we need to start preparing ahead of time for these events. And we can't really rely on our leadership to prepare for us. So these 100-year events like earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, meteor impacts, these sound wild. They sound outlandish. They sound like things that we really don't need to think about. But just 2 months ago, a global pandemic that would predictably take the life of 100,000 Americans, that was not on anybody's radar. So similarly, these other sorts of problems we might need to get ready for. And that's where makers come in, okay? So artisans, craftspeople, inventors, basically it's up to us to fill that gap in supply to meet the demand for these products. It really is important that we harness the highly skilled workers that we know or that are in our communities. If there are workers who are unemployed or who are underemployed because of shifts in global supply chains or companies shutting down due to this pandemic or due to the coming recession or depression, that doesn't mean they can't actually still make things. So let's get them involved in workshops and tool libraries. Let's put 3D printers and consumer level tools in their hands so that they can be empowered to at least help their communities through these uneven times of scarcity. And here are some examples. I just listed a few examples of types of local economic activity that could become more prominent after this pandemic or even during the pandemic. We're already starting to see people, I mentioned at the beginning, but I'll say it again. I have a 3D printer, and earlier, today and yesterday, I put in orders for 2 more 3D printers, and I've gotten donations from, my personal network to help fund the effort to make masks using these 3D printers. I want to make masks for our medical professionals who are on the front lines right now, saving lives. And similarly, people will step up. I mean, there have been a lot of jokes about biohacking a vaccine for the virus, but potentially biohacking, quote unquote, which is just sort of localized medical research, I guess you could say, that could potentially start to happen. Maybe not quite in a sort of a DIY sense, but at just one step up from DIY, you could start to see that. Food forests and permaculture. Deanna and Malcolm just mentioned at the beginning that they're looking to grow their own food, bake their own bread. That sort of thing is going to be, we'll start to probably see much more of that. Automotive engineering, cars will still break down, even though Toyota and Mitsubishi might not be shipping them in from Asia. People will still need their cars. And so, we might start to see auto mechanics step up and start designing cars and building cars and fixing cars in a more locally driven way to meet local demands when global companies can't. Housing is always going to be a local industry, and there are many others. So these are just a few that I could think of off the top of my head. Now, the end result of all of this is that we might start to see the US and Europe and first world, quote unquote, first world countries look like, quote unquote, third world countries, which, in India, for instance, craftsmen have been at it for millennia, thousands of years. And these countries have deep cultures of local production, local manufacturing that they, we can learn if we're humble enough and open to learning about how these economies work. We can borrow from some of these craftsmen and from some of these cultures and incorporate more of that into our supply chains at a local level, so that we're more resilient when these times of scarcity occur. It's really important that we do this because of the benefits that come along with these sorts of efforts. For one thing, at the local level, labor is always available. Wherever there's a community, there are people who can work and make things. And those people they know the resources that they have. It's hard for a global company to come in to a local community and really work with that community in a sensitive way. There have been efforts for this to happen, but we know that global corporations, the hallmark of their efforts is to, quote unquote, professionalize. And professionalize really just means, globalize their skills, or make their skills something that is generalizable outside of their local community, right? So community knowledge, local knowledge is going to become, is hopefully going to become, but really already is an advantage and a value that we can capitalize on now. And thankfully, these sorts of things can still be networked because we have the internet. So communities can get together. Ian mentioned at the beginning that he's thinking about putting up some document somewhere where we can pool all our resources, provide contact information and information to get involved in local communities right now to help with the pandemic. We'll start to see more of that as well, hopefully. And Ian, I'd like to talk to you afterwards because that idea has occurred to me as well, and I've already got a domain in mind. If you'd like to set up a website to sort of create a directory of efforts like the one that Malcolm is leading in Atlanta, to coordinate efforts across communities. The other thing that we'll start to see is, again, because scarcity is unpredictable, these sorts of jobs and efforts, you might not even want to call them jobs. They're really going to be sort of projects. They're flexible. They kind of will come and go as scarcity comes and goes for different products at different times, during different, environments, right? So this idea of a gig economy will really expand beyond the sort of idea of Uber and the Instacart and these sort of apps that allow you to kind of jump in and out of a service. It hopefully, I hope, will become much more of a respected profession. It'll be a supported profession to have several skills that you can apply at different times to help your community survive and prosper despite global scarcity. All right. And if you have any other ideas, I'd love to hear them at the end of this talk. Now, the thing is, there are still going to be downsides, of course, to these sorts of locally driven economic efforts. And one of those is going to be the fact that when communities are making their own products, it's going to be harder for regulatory agencies to manage and make sure that consumers are protected. Okay, so um, you know, for instance, in India, it's really a regulatory nightmare to try to keep every single potter making the same type of pottery. Like that's just not going to happen, right? Similarly, in America, we might need to see certain things relax. A good example right now is the CDC has actually released guidance saying that healthcare workers can use homemade masks as a last resort. So Children's Hospital of Philadelphia has begun accepting homemade masks and calling on the community to provide homemade masks. And they literally mean, take your pillowcase, cut it up into squares, and sew it together into a cloth mask. And hospitals across the country are doing this. New York City is desperate for homemade masks right now. So if you want to get involved, that's something you can do, and we can, provide links on how to do that. But we're going to hopefully start to see much more of that sort of dynamic regulatory environment, regulatory guidance, where on an ad hoc basis, as needed, people or regulatory agencies will allow communities to respond to their needs, which would be great. So the other side of that coin, though, is you're, as a consumer, you're going to have to be a little bit more careful about what you buy, right? So just because your community makes it doesn't mean that it is safe. And you might not have the same amounts of transparency into the production of those goods as you would from a global corporation where everything is open and visible. At the same time, global corporations are known for being secretive about these things. So it could go either way. If you know that your car is being built by Uncle Jim 3 doors down your block, well, you can walk over to Uncle Jim's garage and peek in and look at what kinds of catalytic converter he's putting into your car, right? That sort of thing might be, more or less a problem. But the point is you have to be vigilant. So the upshot of all of this is that, and I really hope this happens, that in the US we see at least a minor cultural renaissance where, because relaxed regulations and empowered communities using consumer level tools that are increasing in power, like CNC machines and 3D printers, because they are all doing their own slightly different designs and making products slightly differently, putting their own touches on different products according to local needs and demands, we might move away from this monoculture that America is so famous for, where you can drive down the same long boulevard in any state in the country and you'll see the same stores everywhere. You'll see a Home Depot, a McDonald's, a Staples, Men's Warehouse, etc., an Arby's. You'll see the same shops everywhere, the same companies. This idea of professionalism, the point of professionalism is to remove the local touches and flavors that these global corporations can't really abide by, right? They need to standardize everything. So as those local communities are empowered, they'll hopefully, become more vibrant and create their own products with their own flavors. Similarly to how you would see different products being made in Europe and in Asia and South America, different regions create, a slightly different type of rug, for instance, or a shirt with different designs, or hats of different styles, right? You'll start to see those sorts of things pop up, hopefully. The other side of this is that as communities learn to make all these products themselves, they'll become more self-sufficient. And that goes back to the quote by the economist that I had at the beginning, Branko. He said that we'll start to see the economy move towards a natural economy, and a self-sufficient economy, right? So this idea of self-sufficiency has echoes in history. For instance, we all love to compare the U.S. to the Roman Empire, which that's a terrible comparison if you ask me, but nonetheless we do it. After the Roman Empire fell, the Roman Empire didn't really fall at one point. It sort of slowly disintegrated for a number of reasons, different wars and whatever, kind of caused this slow disintegration. And as the empire sort of disintegrated, communities became more and more self-sufficient because they couldn't rely on the centralized, globalized process of the empire. And these fiefdoms could produce everything that their peasantry needed to survive. And we might start to see that more. So there might be more of a Philadelphia flavor to the products that we see in our homes. There might be more of an Atlanta flavor, a New York flavor, more than there already is, and that would be interesting. So let's see what comes. Okay, so the end result of all of this. This is kind of the post-pandemic economy. This is the argument I'm making in this presentation. Is we're going to see this kind of coming together of the globalized, centralized, and automated manufacturing networks meeting the localized, distributed, personalized networks. And there's going to be this middle ground somewhere, somewhere in between is where things will be really interesting. It'll be interesting to see after the pandemic, where this balance falls. And it'll be, asymmetric potentially. Different industries may see higher amounts of localization, or, different industries will see more decentralization. We'll see how it plays out. But what I do think will start to happen, and is already happening, is the growth of this community-led, localized economic activity. It's going to gain much more sort of trust from consumers, right? We have nothing else right now. We have to make our own masks. We have to grow our food. And it's sort of a moment of, I would say, a wake up for our entire nation, where we're kind of sort of being jolted out of our sort of stupor and our dependence on the federal government. Interestingly, this is kind of an argument for federalism, in the sense of, federalism as a network of connected states that are sort of independent and working together under more a centralized power, but as part of a decentralized network. And it's interesting to see states starting to implement these sorts of attitudes as they ban citizens of other states from entering, right? So, Delaware, people from Pennsylvania can't go down to Delaware right now. If we do, we have to stay in quarantine for 14 days, right? So same in Florida, people from New York suddenly can't go down to Florida. Florida people can't go up to New York. Different states have different relationships, but the point is they're starting to enforce their borders. And that's something we haven't seen in a long time, at least not in this way, on a mass scale, that in a way that affects us on a local level. So, I grew up 20 minutes from the border of Delaware. If I wanted to go down there 20 minutes, I used to be able to go down there. They have no sales tax. It's great. Now I can't do that. So those sorts of things we'll start to see. The conclusion, all of this is, solidarity. Let's work together to, not only destroy this pandemic and overcome the current scarcity, but learn from this event and hopefully build an economy that is more responsive to needs at the local level, so that we're never put in this situation again where suddenly we don't have what we need, we don't have the skills, we don't have the organization to respond to local needs. Okay, so with that, I guess I'll open it up for questions and discussion. Thanks. So yeah, I guess, what does everybody think of all of that? I know it's a lot to go through. If you have any questions or comments, yeah, let me know.
Well, I have a whole bunch, but I guess one thing that going backwards through my memory of what we talked about, you mentioned this idea of like the economy being more reminiscent of a medieval economy, like or even Dark Ages economy, which not that it's going to exactly mimic that, but that the same forces are kind of coming into play that created that in some way. And it occurs to me like there were fiefdoms, certainly, but also there were other sort of models for economies that weren't necessarily didn't necessarily embrace this idea. Like when I think of a fief, I think of a community that like has gotten together and it says our philosophy is that we give that guy the biggest stick we can find and then we make him happy. And he kind of as long as he's happy and protecting the community, that's what the system is. Maybe that's a little simplistic in terms of fiefdoms, but my point is there were other systems like crofting systems in like the Scottish model that were much more community focused, or systems like the Scottish clan system, which was much more family based, not necessarily community based, but family based. There were sort of bishoprics that acted kind of like communes in some ways. There are all sorts of different sort of models that were floating around, and my question is, I guess, how sensible a thought do you think it is that any of those could replace this idea of fiefdoms, which are very, I mean, they're autonomous in one sense, but they're also very authoritarian, at least in the way they were organized in medieval society.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's obviously you bring up a lot of good examples. You bring up several other examples of systems that we could look to for reference points about the way this could all work. Fiefdoms is just one example. Crofts is just one example. Medieval China has other examples that we can look at. Medieval Japan, again, has different examples. The point is that we're going to have local community control. If that occurs in a more or less authoritarian way, that's the way the cookie crumbles. We're already seeing some countries at a national level go the authoritarian way in a sort of reaction to this pandemic, not necessarily because of global supply chains breaking down specifically, but that is a driving factor. So for instance, Hungary just yesterday passed a law that essentially makes Hungary a dictatorship. If you guys haven't checked that out, I suggest looking into what just happened in Hungary. Viktor Orban has now basically taken over. He has rule by decree. He has suspended the parliament. It's a bad situation. So as you say, like the way this manifests, it could vary by region, it could vary by state. So that's a great point, and it's hard to say exactly what it'll look like at this point. We'll just have to see. And I think I also don't mean to imply that the end result of all of this is going to be something as dramatic as states breaking apart and into fiefdoms necessarily. It's more that a little bit more of these community-driven efforts will be a part of our daily lives. That's how I would characterize it, I guess. Yeah. So, but great point. Yeah. Does anybody else have questions or comments? One thing I was interested in hearing about was what everybody, if there are any engineers or anybody knows about automation here or banking, what you think about globalization and the effect on the global economy. But, any comments?
Hi, Sean.
Just speak.
Hey.
Hey, I'm getting the idea. So my sense of pandemics is that they either spike and go down, or it's a wave and it goes down. And then there might be more waves, but eventually that particular pandemic evens out. So, but it sounds like your thoughts are based on the idea that we will have in the future a constant conditions of global disruption. Is that right? Because otherwise I can see the economy in the way that the economy adapts to the expansion contraction cycles, where basically workers get screwed for a while and
right.
Then the economy comes back and then they work and then everybody, bad money goes around and then the whole thing collapses again. But
right.
so that idea of regular catastrophes within the economic system is sort of relegated. The people who suffer from it are the workers, and the system sort of adapts to it. There are ways that the system recovers, which work especially well for the capitalists. But it sounds like you're thinking of a global environment. And by that, I mean the planet, in which the disruptions aren't going to come from the natural cycles of the economy, but are actually going to come from outside the economy. Is that right?
Yeah, I think at least that's going to be a part of the future. I don't know if it's, obviously capitalism is going to continue its cycles of crashes and growth and crash and growth. But, I do think we're going to see many more. There's at least, let's put it this way, this event has woken us up as a planet, I would say, in a way that we weren't aware of before. And this was supposed to be a 100-year event, but now that there are, however many billions of people on the planet, we're all on top of each other. Let's just talk about pandemics. There is a good chance that we will see more pandemics like this more frequently going forward. There's no reason to think that China will shut down these meat markets or whatever you want to call them, or that they'll try to regulate the trade of rare animals, random types of birds, and all different types of bats. It turns out that bats are the most diverse order of mammals. 1 in 4 species of mammals are bats, right? And bats have immune systems that are very similar to ours. So when you put bats in a market next to chickens and next to snakes and pangolins and whatever other animals, you get transmissions. And these sorts of environments, as they expand, as people come in contact with more bugs in the jungle. We're cutting down the Amazon. We're cutting down jungles everywhere. Who knows what's in those jungles? The permafrost in the Arctic is melting. Who knows what little bugs are stuck in the ice up there? There are all sorts of sources of germs that are novel that we have no immune response to that could develop. And that's just pandemics. Global climate change is going to cause massive disruption in the seasons. Literally, the temperature of the cycle of the seasons is going to change. And I was reading one report last year that Philadelphia in 50 years will feel like Miami. It's going to be that hot that you'll be able to grow palm trees in Philadelphia. If we don't really respond, which doesn't look like we're going to, but that's my pessimism, but hopefully we'll figure that out. But the point is, I think we at least need to be prepared to respond to these sorts of events. We need to be ready to deal with scarcity. And it's not like these sorts of events are going to create symmetric scarcity across the economy. The types of scarcity that we'll see are going to fluctuate in unpredictable ways, and it's going to be a dynamic seasonal process. So you might see, the ramping up as a pandemic ramps up, workers will stay home. That will create scarcity of products in some parts of the economy. And as the pandemics recede, workers start to come back into the economy to produce those goods. Meanwhile, earthquakes will take out certain factories somewhere else. It's all going to be a little bit chaotic. And we're not even getting into migrations of humans around the world. The point is, we need to be more locally connected so that we can maintain our lifestyles, or at least maintain some semblance of our security. Let's put it that way. Yeah. So that is what I'm saying. Yeah.
But I wonder whether, if as that happens, we're going to have to give up our dependence on certain kinds of technology that are standardized on a very highly technical level. So, for example, I'm thinking about, what you're saying about local artisanship and manufacturing and so forth. So that would work well for a lot of things like food production and maybe clothing and certain other kinds of basic needs, and maybe even some luxuries that have like a component of refinement to them. But when you're getting into sort of the really high tech commodities, whether that's medical, like biomedical equipment, or even just you gave the example of iPhones. It's very hard to mobilize sort of a local workforce to have the skills that not only the material, but the technical skills to make those things on a level that can compete in terms of economy of scale. Even if you could, train that workforce. So, in order for what you're talking about to take place, I wonder if we would just have to sort of say, okay, well, we're not going to be as technological a society or as technological a world anymore. We're going to be willing to give that up, which I think is unlikely, or we're forced to give that up because there's no way that kind of technology on a large scale can maintain itself in the face of the kind of disruptions that you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I think we could see some of that. I think a good way to maybe see a vision of a possible future would be to look at third world countries who operate on similar levels of scarcity that we might have to get used to. India is a great example. Parts of Africa are great examples, and they're all online. They're all technologically with it. You can walk into a kitchen in any part of the world and you'll notice a similar type of dishwasher, the same type of shower head. It'll all middle class looks slightly different in different countries, but there is a comparable amount of lifestyle, or a comparable lifestyle across classes in different countries. And I think what we'll start to see is a diversity of what it means to be middle class what it means to be poor. The poor will hope. I want to empower the poor by, bringing tools and specialized equipment to an education to lower classes. I think middle classes will have to learn to get by, as you say, without certain luxury goods like iPhones, like Louis Vuitton bags, like diamonds. We might not be able to really count on those sorts of products being available to us whenever we want. But that's what a luxury good is, right? It's sort of a scarce resource. And I think what we'll start to see is more that when your iPhone breaks, you might not be able to repair it, or you might need to rely on some local person in your community to repair it instead of just buying a new iPhone, which is what a lot of people do, right? That sort of thing might end. So you might end up sort of getting one iPhone and then sticking with that iPhone for a decade, as opposed to getting the latest model of everything all the time. And it's this sort of idea of everything being available, everything being fresh, everything being easy, convenient, immediate, cheap. It's the sort of American lifestyle of convenience that we might have to get used to being a little, doing away with a little bit more. We might want to start that garden in the backyard so that we don't have to rely on imported tomatoes from wherever. We have our own tomatoes, those sorts of things. So our favorite brand of, sneaker might not always be available, but if we buy a Nike once, we can repair the sole of that shoe over and over and over again and still, get use out of it. And that sort of thing, I think we might start to see more. And that's what happens in the third world, quote unquote, third world, much more. You have this stratification of classes, where the ultra rich can afford these sorts of luxury goods. Lower classes have no chance of even touching luxury goods. But then in between the poor and the ultra rich, there's this vast range of different classes, artisans, professionals, whoever, and everybody's sort of moving around up and down in this class structure, depending on their ability to participate in different markets. That's essentially what I think will happen. So I don't think we're going to see a drop in connectivity so much. In fact, I think what will happen is connectivity will be the lifeline that communities depend on to coordinate responses. And if the internet goes down, then none of this matters, honestly. Like, that's it. That's game over. So I don't think that's going to happen. Yeah. But I do think we'll have to get used to a little bit more scarcity.
I have a question/comment, because it seems to me that what you're describing from an artisan and craftsperson point of view is essentially some version of a cooperative economy, which I am 100% in favor of. But also I think that there's a problem of you still need capital to create a cooperative economy, right? Like if we just start our own network, our own economic networks right now and say, screw the government, screw the banks, screw the corporations, what'll end up happening is the people who have relatively more resources will control that process. And you would just be basically recreating a class structure. My biggest critique of automation has always been that it's being run by ultra wealthy capitalist trillionaires who do not give, excuse my language, who do not give a shit whether poor people live or die. And I think that there's governments and kind of investing institutions have a big role to play here in terms of, if we are proving that the global economy has a lot of flaws and that to sustain ourselves, we need to relocalize the economy. In my opinion, there has to be some way to hold hold the wealthy and banks and investors accountable for actually investing in that cooperative economy, which I don't have any faith in our government to do. But so I guess to phrase this as a question, as opposed to my opinion, what are some ways that what are some roles that governments can play in actually using this as an opportunity to decrease economic inequality and create a more horizontally structured, localized economy? And how on earth do we convince people who have a lot of money to invest that they have to do this?
Yeah, unfortunately, I was hoping to ask you that question. So I don't know. That is the literally the $1 trillion question. I guess we just have to keep organizing. You are on the front lines of those sorts of efforts, and you know better than I the challenges that are involved in organizing. But I think it's only through collective power that we can hold the rich accountable. And there is this notion that I'm beginning to sort of think about. One thing I've been really interested in the last couple of months, I'm returning to thinking about pacifism and pacifist movements and the origins of Gandhi's philosophy of pacifism. And his political ideas were specifically related to developing the collective will to impose economic scarcity on the wealthy. So, if we can return and learn from Gandhi's methods, learn from our own version of those traditions in Martin Luther King's legacy, we might be able to figure out how to organize economic protests and use strikes and other sorts of I guess to give another example that's not a strike, one thing that Gandhi's famous for is making his own clothes, right? Homespun wool. And that's on the Indian flag is the wheel that you use to spin thread. And the reason that's there is to show that we on the local level, we don't need global, global corporations. We don't need centralized powers to provide for ourselves. We can make our own clothes. If we need salt, we can march to the ocean and make salt. If we need food, we can grow it ourselves. We just have to be willing to do it. That's really all it is it's just the will to accept a certain lifestyle and scarcity that maybe isn't as convenient and as comfortable, but is politically more empowered. It's more responsible. It's more authentic to who we are, and the point is through collectivized, organized efforts that you are actually doing, Malcolm. If we expand those efforts, we can essentially make the rich irrelevant. Like we don't need them. Yeah. And that might be the answer. So.
Hi, Sean.
Madhavi wants to say something.
Hi.
Hi.
Okay. Hi. I thought it was pretty interesting, some of the things you were talking about. And I just wanted to point out that, for an example, the biggest corporation that I can think of right now, Disney, they have closed their the parks, which is a really huge, big deal because I can't imagine how much revenue they bring in each year, every month, every week. It's capitalist paradise anytime you walk into a Disney World. And I wanted to point out that that some of the ideas about what are we going to do now that we don't have self-sufficient, being self-sufficient. I had a teacher at Villanova who was talking about how Gandhi had such a big influence on him when he was when he was in college studying, and he was talking about the whole concept of the village having, having different little industries, quote unquote, in a village. Like there'll be a blacksmith, there'll be someone else who
Silversmith.
is someone else who would have, raise cattle. Someone else would be, someone else would have horses. Somebody else would do the sewing. So like that, when you have the like the manor, the concept of a fiefdom, you have the lord of the manor, and all the peasants would bring to the lord of the manor. They would bring their tribute. They would bring part of their crops as part of their payment for protection from marauders, and they would owe their loyalty to the lord of the manor. I'm wondering, like, for instance, I think a lot of the preppers, and Sean, I've talked to you about this, the video, the podcast, quote, Bo, the fifth column. He's talking about a lot of the preppers who basically were saying, see, I told you this was going to happen, and now it's happened, and so they're very proud of themselves that they saw all this coming, and they've stockpiled away all these provisions for themselves, and how that can be distributed towards to those in need. But I thought that was interesting. I don't know if Sean, you've seen some of those those specific videos that he was talking about, the preppers.
Yeah, I have. And I think he makes some good points about how these preppers should probably, a lot of them are sitting on huge stockpiles of N95 masks, and they should probably give those to hospitals right now.
I think he said exactly that.
Right. Yeah. So yeah. That's a little side note, but in general, I think preppers are a controversial bunch, to say the least. Right. They are in many ways paranoid, I would say. But the thing that preppers are one example of something that I think is particularly true of Americans, which is that we are independent minded. We don't like authoritarian control. We like self-sufficiency, and it comes from the origins of our nation as sort of this myth of the frontier, and this whole for better or for worse, we obviously participated in a genocide of amazing proportions. That's terrible, obviously, but there is this sort of leftover mythos of homesteading and this culture of independence, and specifically politically decentralized. My turf is my turf, and I can do what I want, and I don't have to work with you if I don't want to. So some amount of that could actually be our saving grace. And preppers, they're a little bit too independent-minded, in my opinion. But one thing that Bo does say in some of these videos is even preppers need to work together. You can't respond to crises like pandemics, or a lot of right-wing fringe people are worried about a martial law or whatever, which is not going to happen. But people are worried about that. In order to respond to a government that tries to impose martial law or tries to take over, people will have to work together. So even the libertarians, even the ultra individualist people in this country will have to work together on some level, even to provide defense for themselves in their own ways. So I think some amount of that frontier spirit, some amount of that homesteading spirit is good. But again, yeah, it's controversial. So yeah.
Hey, Sean.
Hi, Dharma. Yeah, hi.
Yeah, I loved your bringing up the Gandhian principle. I
Yeah.
really thank you for that, because I'm just going to comment on the fact that I saw that personally in my own life, how my father was a Gandhian. He made his own clothes. He just really lived it and showed us how that can be done, because we were like um, five daughters, five girls, and two boys that remained, of course. And then, but there were a lot of other cousins, lot of relatives that came in. But how did they manage that economy in the house? That was what was excellent. You know, we made our own butter, we made our own buttermilk, and we had the clothes that were recycled. Like, for example, if one wore that one beautiful dress that just was handed down in a beautiful form. It was kept away, and then it was just distributed to the other children. And if we bought some very good shoes, we didn't have shoes because it's a tropical country. We had what you call slipper. They call it slippers, like sandals kind of thing. If something wore out, some guy came in near the house and that got repaired. We used the repaired thing, and then we had everything was recycled. Like, for example, we had a banana tree in every house. That one banana tree yielded, believe it or not, 300, 400 bananas in one thing. If you go to Longwood Gardens and see it, you will see how it is produced. And that took care of a lot of food for the entire family and the incoming relatives. And we just had mangoes that were pickled in different forms and 3-foot jars that were put away. And then you could feed for the entire year, pickles and jars of pickles. And so that is how they economized what they got, and they just got a lot out of it. So I've seen this, and I can go on and on and on about it. How we enjoyed. I also did the taking off the yarn, that takali as they called it. We made our own clothes. We had to give that and then take some fabric in return, and that was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun, and I also want to suggest that we can think of this public radio. You can have little radio stations and then give people knowledge what you have. And we had public radios. We had not had commercials when we were growing up. So we can talk about it in your next session. And I found it very interesting. Congratulations. And I really appreciate your telling this. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that's wonderful, and I hope we have in this country. I hope we have the wisdom to learn from.
I'm not saying that you should get rid of the industrialization. You have a lot of modern equipment, but at the same time, if you adapt what you had back home, I think we can have a much better, more prosperous life with what we have. And Madhavi brought in a very good point. Her professor, I think Gangadin, probably.
Wasn't it? It's a different one.
Oh, there was a different one. Okay. She used to talk about this, and I think that was an excellent point that she brought. Each locality we had our own pottery man. My mom made her own, oven that she built in every house that we went to. She made her own oven with clay, and that she cooked with either charcoal or with fuel, and that was excellent way. I know how to make it if you bring me some clay, and that was nice to see that, how to make butter, how to make ghee, how to make buttermilk. And these are all excellent ideas, and there are a lot of things we can talk about it in the next session. Thank you. It was nice seeing you all. That was lovely. Thank you.
Yeah, that's perfect. I agree completely. And I guess that's a great place to end it, right? So thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Sean.
Yeah, we'll pass it back to Ian.
Yeah, thanks. That was amazing.
Hey,
Bye.
nice seeing you guys.
Yeah, good to see everyone. That was a really in-depth look at at some of the issues that are going to be coming our way in terms of the economics. I guess the talk of specifically the tie-in of like what we can learn from, say, India, reminds me of a situation that I'm gonna talk about briefly, because I can do that. Which is, I was out teaching in Colorado, and I was supposed to be there to teach something called Agile philosophy, which don't get me started on that. I don't want to talk about it.
What philosophy? Can you
Agile
repeat that?
philosophy, which is just basically production philosophy. But I worked with a guy who was a remote worker from India, and he heard our lectures, he heard our talks, and he said, "Oh, in India we've done that for so long that there's just a word for it. Like we don't. It's not agile. We call it." He said the word was jugad, which is like to make, to like do what you can with what you have, jugad, or to make new solutions out of the materials at hand. So it seems like that ties in a lot with what you're saying.
Yeah. Some of what was described reminded me of how life was when I was growing up.
Mm-hmm.
But I have to say I'm really appreciative of my modern equipment, like the one we are using now. So I wouldn't want to lose that, but keep the old, not throw everything out with the bathwater. But some of the encouraging things is how ecology is coming back, is breathing a sigh of relief now that we are all indoors and not constantly polluting the environment. Some of the animals are, of course, they're starved for food, but the others are showing their face a little bit. People are taking movies of how some of the wild animals are running around.
Yeah.
Apparently, some of the rivers are flowing more clear, and so on. But there is a lesson here if we don't forget to not, burden our earth so much. I think some of it's becoming a little more clear and illustrated during this pandemic. And I hope we continue to adapt some of those lessons in the future.
Yeah, I definitely agree, and I think like these are all topics that I'm really hoping we can get talks on at some point in this lecture series. Like I know I said that our hope was that this wasn't going to be just coronavirus related stuff, just pandemic related stuff, that it would be more broad. That said, all of this stuff is on people's minds. So we would love it if people brought like ideas for talks about all of these topics. I mean, we've got probably a dozen ideas for things we could talk about coming out of this. In terms of like what's coming down the road, we don't have any hard and fast like dates and times for the next talk, but I'm planning on doing one certainly in the next week or so. That's going to be on the history of TOEFL games, which were board games from the Scandinavian region that were played during the Dark Ages. So that'll, learn about TOEFL, and that'll help get you through some quarantine days in Norwegian winter style. We've got a couple of other things coming down the road, but I don't want to like get too specific on them. But just keep your eyes open. We'll post the schedule and links, and if you're on our mailing list, you'll get the invitations. But yeah,
are you under time limitation, Ian? Because Vimla wants to say something quickly.
I'm not under time limitation. I want to make sure like everyone doesn't stay up till 2 a.m, but definitely we can keep talking. I just wanted to get this sort of administrative stuff done.
1 minute, I want to use this opportunity to say that my husband Rajagopal would have been very proud of this talk, because he came from that kind of a Gandhian family, and his mother she had seen Mahatma Gandhi, and then she had been in very close touch. Her father was in close touch with Mahatma Gandhi. And I want to remember that Raju passed away on 2nd of April, 2 years ago. And Ram was telling me just today that we should do something in memory of him. And then I would like to get in touch with you all pretty soon, just to think about it, just a short get together where we all talk about things that are dear to us, and then I will give you details a little later. I really am proud of all of you. Thank you. Be safe and be happy. And then I'm glad we are all family. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks everyone for coming
Hi.
out. Yeah. Hey.
Hi.
Go ahead, Bob.
Okay. This discussion tonight has quite a history to it. And it reminded me of at least two books that I think are pertinent. One of which is called Small is Beautiful. And it's by an economist by the name of Schumacher. And I don't remember his first name. But I think it was Edward. The second book and that book was written really in the 1970s already. But a more recent one that helps to operationalize the concepts of Small is Beautiful is another book written in the last 10 years. And it is called Banker to the Poor. And the fellow that wrote it won a Nobel Prize for it. And it was a way of, it was an attitude towards lending money that included the poor. Poor, in this case, refers to people who normally, what we might call the standard or conventional or establishment banks, would not consider unworthy. For one thing, they weren't attempting to borrow enough to make it worthwhile for banks to lend the money. And of course, they don't have credit ratings. But there were community organizations in India that learned how to establish banks for just those people, that whole caste or class or group that were excluded from the standard economy and therefore only had the sale of their labor to live off of, and the sale of that labor was hard to accomplish and it didn't pay much. Whereas people who could get these very small, short-term, low-interest loans, kind of folk banks, were able to establish businesses and employ others and develop local goods, goods that were needed locally. So I would recommend that we take a look at those two books. I think you have rekindled my interest in reading those two books.
Good. Yeah. Oh, I always love to end with literature and further reading stuff. So that's really, really helpful. Maybe we can do another talk on those things in particular, and explore some of those concepts. Yeah, so I guess we'll move towards wrapping up now. Just because I'm aware that it's getting a little late. I want to shout out all of the sort of organizational things that I have to take care of. Again, like if you're not on the mailing list, we have a mailing list set up. I'm putting the link on the screen, but for anyone in the Hangouts, I'm putting the form here. We can continue to talk about these things at a later get together, because our plan is to do these pretty regularly. Yeah, and to just use this sort of quarantine situation as a time when we can redouble our efforts to teach each other and learn from each other, and talk to each other. So thanks again, everyone, and thanks for sticking around. Oh, the other thing I wanted to say, I like long question sections. I like doing these things for a long time. If it gets if people have to go to bed or have things to do because they weren't planning on doing a 2-hour talk, you can get up and leave. I don't think anyone's going to be offended. But I do like this sort of letting them go, and letting them continue in their discussions. So that's kind of going to be the mode. I'll let you all control when you enter and exit. So thanks again to Sean, our speaker today. That was an amazing talk.
Thank you, Sean.
Thank you, Sean.
Thank you, Sean.
All right.
Thank you,
You're welcome.
Sarah.
Bye.
See you all.
Take care, everybody.
See
Bye.
you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Nancy.
We're done. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Oh, that was fun. I have a question for Shauna.